In the beginning there was hunger. Before the written word, before the rise of cities, and long before the first seed was sown in soil, there was the primal need to eat. And it wasn't a question of preference, but of survival. For the earliest humans, every meal was a matter of life or death. The act of eating wasn't just nourishment, it was defiance, a quiet rebellion against extinction. Tens of thousands of years ago, in a world unrecognizable to us now, our ancestors lived hand-to-mouth in unforgiving landscapes. Forests dense with predators, savannas scorched by the sun, and tundras cold enough to stop a heartbeat in minutes. These were not gentle environments, and yet somehow against all odds humanity endured. But what did they eat? More importantly, what did they cook? When we imagine cooking, we picture stoves, spices, recipes handed down through generations. But long before kitchens existed, cooking began as a raw and dangerous experiment, born not from culture, but from necessity. And at the center of it all was fire. The control of fire was not an invention. It was a discovery, one that likely happened by accident, in a moment both terrifying and mesmerizing. A lightning strike, a branch ignited, a spark from flint against stone. At some unknown point in our distant past, hominins saw fire not as a force to flee, but as a tool to wield. And when they did, everything changed. Because fire didn't just bring warmth, it brought transformation. It turned tough fibrous roots into soft, digestible food. It turned meat from a dangerous, bacteria-ridden gamble into a safer, longer-lasting resource. It illuminated the night, warded off predators, and created a social hearth, a space for storytelling, bonding, and perhaps the earliest whispers of culture. The oldest known evidence of controlled fire dates back nearly 1 million years, at a site called Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Deep inside, archaeologists found ash and charred bone, signs that early hominins, likely Homo erectus, were not only using fire, but cooking with it. They may not have had recipes or even language as we know it, but they understood something essential. Cooked food kept you alive. So what did they cook? The answer is as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. Prehistoric humans were opportunistic eaters, scavengers, foragers, and eventually hunters. Their diets depended heavily on what the environment offered. In Africa, they ate tubers, wild fruits, and the occasional roasted insect. Along coastal regions, shellfish and seaweed became staples. In colder climates, mammoth meat and marrow were vital sources of fat and energy. One of the most important developments in this evolutionary buffet was the shift from raw to cooked meat. Cooking made calories more accessible. It reduced chewing time. It softened tissues and unlocked nutrients. And over thousands of years, this simple act may have reshaped our bodies. Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that cooking predigests food, allowing humans to extract more energy and evolve smaller guts and bigger brains. In other words, cooking didn't just change our meals, it changed us. But meat wasn't the only thing on the menu. Across the continents, archaeological evidence reveals a surprisingly broad palette. In Israel's Gesher Benot Yaakov, 780,000-year-old remains show not only cooked fish but burned plant materials, evidence of early humans using fire to process both animal and plant foods. In northern Europe, Neanderthals left behind hearths filled with charred legumes, grains, and nuts. And in Australia, Aboriginal ancestors used earth ovens to slow-cook yams, marsupials, and more, techniques that have been passed down through oral tradition for over 60,000 years. It wasn't always gourmet, it wasn't always pretty, but it was ingenious. Humans didn't just stumble onto edible things, they experimented. They soaked toxic seeds to leach out poisons. They roasted bitter roots until they were sweet. They dried berries to preserve them. They crushed, pounded, fermented, and eventually boiled. With nothing but stone tools and fire, they built the foundations of global cuisine. And yet, these innovations weren't simply culinary. They were social. Cooking required patience, attention, planning. You couldn't chase prey and tend a fire at the same time. For the first time in our evolutionary history, food preparation demanded cooperation. Someone had to gather, someone had to guard, someone had to cook. Around the fire, humans began to specialize, to share, to build relationships that extended beyond the individual. This wasn't just survival, it was society in its earliest form. As we trace the ashes of prehistoric meals, a portrait begins to form. Not of brutish cavemen gnawing on raw bones, but of thoughtful, observant, innovative people. People who learned, who adapted, who cooked not just for sustenance, but for the people beside them. And through this lens, food becomes more than calories. It becomes memory, identity, culture. To understand what prehistoric humans actually cooked, we must first abandon the idea that they were mindless eaters, driven only by hunger. Because if the fire gave us survival, it also gave us choice. And with choice came taste. As humans moved across continents, they didn't just adapt to new environments, they learned to manipulate them, to forage strategically, to experiment, to transform what was bitter into something nourishing, what was hard into something soft, and what was bland into something memorable. For a long time, scientists underestimated just how varied and sophisticated prehistoric diets truly were. The stereotype of meat-heavy, hyper-masculine hunter societies dominated our imagination. But the truth is more nuanced, more diverse, and often the most critical members of the early culinary chain weren't the hunters with spears, but the foragers with knowledge passed from one generation to the next, through experience, through memory, and perhaps even through song. In places like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where Neanderthals buried their dead with pollen traces of edible plants, we find more than just ritual. We find dietary hints, seeds from wild legumes, traces of dates, figs, and grasses. Burned plant remains suggest cooking, intentional, methodical. A 2022 study even revealed molecular traces of cooked pulses, like wild lentils ground and mixed with water to form rudimentary pastes or doughs. These weren't random collections of plants, they were recipes of a kind. Primitive, yes, but carefully chosen. And so emerges an idea that challenges modern assumptions. Prehistoric humans did not merely eat what they had to. They made choices. They combined ingredients. They experimented with form and flavor. In the dry highlands of Jordan, archaeological layers at a site called Shubaika 1 revealed something remarkable. The charred remains of flatbread-like pieces made from wild barley and tubers. These ancient breads, baked over hot stones or in earth ovens, date back over 14,000 years, long before the dawn of agriculture. Think about that. Bread without farms, wheat, or ovens. Bread born of wild grains, gathered by hand, ground by stone, and transformed by fire. It speaks to an early culinary imagination. The ability to envision food not just as survival, but as transformation. And while grains and legumes formed an essential backbone, they weren't alone. Across Ice Age Europe, Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens alike consumed nuts, hazelnuts, acorns, almonds, many of which required processing. Acorns, for example, are packed with bitter tannins that must be leached out. This isn't something you do by accident. It requires soaking, sometimes for days. It's not efficient unless you're planning for the long term, and it's a reminder that prehistoric cooking wasn't merely immediate. It was anticipatory, strategic. They weren't just cooking for today, they were preparing for tomorrow. And it wasn't all plant-based. The myth of the raw carnivore persists, but even meat was rarely eaten raw once fire became widespread. Cooking offered more than safety, it offered versatility. In the Siberian permafrost, ancient hearths tell stories of mammoth hunts. But bones weren't just discarded, they were cracked open, boiled, burned. The goal was marrow, rich, fatty, and nutritious. Where pots didn't exist, humans used animal stomachs as makeshift cooking vessels, placing hot stones inside to boil soups and stews. Think of that ingenuity. No metal, no clay, just instinct, observation, and repetition. Our ancestors didn't wait for tools, they made do with what they had. Even fish, long considered a luxury of settled cultures, played a larger role than we once thought. At Lake Turkana in Kenya, charred catfish bones dating back 1.9 million years hint at early hominins harvesting aquatic life. And in Upper Paleolithic sites in Japan, early Homo sapiens cooked river fish in pits lined with hot stones, adding leaves and moss to trap moisture, primitive steaming techniques. And then there's fermentation. For years, Researchers assumed fermentation was a later innovation, something that arose with settled agriculture. But nature had always been the teacher. Rotting fruit, fermenting roots, the accidental discovery of bubbling brews. Early humans didn't need scientific knowledge to recognize change. They only needed time and observation. The Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies, still drink lightly fermented baobab drinks, a tangy, nutritious beverage that could easily resemble prehistoric practices. Whether intentional or incidental, fermentation gave early humans an advantage, not just in preserving food, but in transforming it, in creating complex flavors, in feeding gut bacteria that helped digest rougher diets, fermented tubers, fermented fish, even proto-alcoholic drinks. None of these are unthinkable in the prehistoric context. So often we imagine prehistoric humans as passive consumers, but they were artisans in their own right. They knew their landscapes intimately. They tracked the seasons, understood the patterns of animals, and recognized which plants were edible, toxic, or medicinal. In some areas they used herbs like garlic mustard, not for calories but for flavor. In one Mesolithic site in Denmark, food residue on pottery showed that fish stews had been seasoned with aromatic leaves. This wasn't necessity, it was taste, it was intention. So perhaps the real question is not what prehistoric humans cooked, but why. Because in every culture, cooking becomes more than fuel, it becomes ritual. It becomes memory, the scent of roasted meat drifting through the cold, the crackle of flatbread on hot stones, the shared silence of people eating together after the hunt before the night. We like to think civilization began with farming, but maybe, just maybe, it began around the fire, with a handful of roots, a piece of seared meat, a soup made from cracked bones and bitter herbs. Maybe that was the first communion, the first act of culture, the first act of us. The moment we planted seed, everything changed. For millions of years, humanity wandered. We moved with the herds, with the rains, with the ripening of berries and the swelling of rivers. The world was our pantry, vast, unpredictable, bountiful in one moment, and merciless in the next. But somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago, in the gentle floodplains of the Fertile Crescent, we stopped and we sowed. It was not a sudden revolution. It was slow, scattered, and uneven, but it was profound, because with the first crops came the first settlements. And with settlements came permanence, and with permanence came a new way of thinking about food, not just as something to find, but something to grow. This shift from hunter-gatherer to farmer reshaped human civilization, but it also radically altered what we cooked, how we cooked, and even how we digested food. The earliest farmers cultivated wild varieties of wheat, barley, chickpeas, and lentils. These weren't the soft, domesticated crops we know today. They were tough, fibrous, and required labor to make them edible. Grinding, soaking, pounding, cooking. Again and again, these became the rhythm of daily life. No longer were meals built around the chase. Now they were built around the harvest, and it wasn't only in Mesopotamia. In the valleys of the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, early Chinese civilizations domesticated millet and rice. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash became cornerstones. In Africa, sorghum and yams. In New Guinea, taro and bananas. In every region, people selected, sowed, and reaped what their land allowed, learning not just how to grow, but how to transform these foods into something edible, and then into something desirable. With farming came a greater reliance on carbohydrate-rich foods, and this had consequences, some positive, others less so. Caloric intake became more stable, but nutrient diversity often declined. Skeletal remains show that many early agricultural societies experienced a drop in overall health. Shorter statures, more cavities, anemia, disease. Life became more predictable but also more fragile. Still, the benefits of staying put outweighed the costs, because cooking, for the first time in history, could become a daily ritual, not just a survival tactic. With clay and fire, people began to shape pots, thick, heavy vessels that could boil grains, simmer stews, and preserve leftovers. In Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest proto-cities in modern-day Turkey, Inhabitants lined their ovens with earth and ash. They made flatbreads from barley and einkorn wheat, baking them on hot stones or within domed clay ovens, precursors to the tandoors and taboons still used in parts of the world today. But the innovation wasn't only in tools, it was in the mind. Cooking ceased to be merely reactive. It became symbolic, ceremonial, communal. At Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known megalithic site, archaeologists discovered massive stone pillars and beside them, evidence of large-scale feasting. Grinding stones, storage pits and vats large enough to hold hundreds of liters of liquid, possibly beer brewed from wild grains. These gatherings were not about nourishment alone. They were about community, status, belief. They were about sharing food, not merely eating it. And that's a crucial shift. In the foraging world, meals were often immediate and mobile. What you found, you ate. What you couldn't carry, you left behind. But in the farming world, food became central. Meals could be planned, prepared, and shared in a fixed location. Kitchens emerged, not as rooms but as concepts, spaces where ingredients came together in expected ways, again and again, until patterns became tradition. With agriculture, also came new ingredients. Domesticated animals provided meat, yes, but also milk, eggs, and fat. In the Levant and Anatolia, sheep and goats became early staples. In South Asia, zebu cattle. In East Asia, pigs and chickens. These animals offered more than just protein. They offered culinary versatility. Milk could be turned into cheese, bones could enrich broths, fat could fry grains or preserve vegetables. And alongside the animals came herbs, cultivated, curated, refined. Onions, garlic, coriander, cumin, small in size but massive in flavor. With them, prehistoric cooking took on new dimensions. What had once been a bland gruel of mashed grain became a seasoned porridge. What had once been a slab of boiled meat became a fragrant stew. Spices didn't just improve taste, they preserved, healed, signaled wealth. In ancient India, turmeric and ginger were already being used medicinally. In the Fertile Crescent, cumin and sumac appeared in early mixtures. By 5000 BCE, humans were already trading flavor across rivers and deserts. So the question deepens, what did prehistoric humans actually cook? By the dawn of farming, they were cooking flatbreads laced with wild herbs. Porridges simmered in clay pots, goat stews thickened with lentils and bitter greens, fish wrapped in leaves and baked under ash, honey-drizzled nuts, roasted grains, perhaps even early beers fermented in earthen jugs. But more than that, they were cooking with memory. Every meal carried the weight of experience. The knowledge of when to sow, how long to dry, how much to grind, what to avoid, what to savor. These were not written recipes, but living ones, etched in hands passed through generations, shaped by trial, by error, by taste. And the act of cooking itself became identity. In the heat of ovens and the stir of pots, humans found rhythm, ritual, a way to mark the day, the season, the ceremony. To cook was to belong, to a family, a clan, a place. It was no longer about the momentary defiance of death. It was about the permanence of life. In the quiet glow of firelight, ancient humans found more than warmth. They found a kind of wonder, because cooking, at its core, was never just about survival, not even in the beginning. From the earliest moments when fire turned flesh to food, cooking became a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. It was an act of transformation, an offering, a ritual, and perhaps a prayer. All across the prehistoric world, the traces are there, subtle, persistent, undeniable. The story of human cooking isn't just carved into bones or scattered seeds, it's etched into burial mounds, hidden beneath ceremonial stones, encoded in the ashes of ancient feasts. In southern Africa at Border Cave, archaeologists discovered the remains of a child buried with grave goods, shells, pigments, and tools. Nearby were traces of cooked starchy plants, specifically rhizomes from the Hypoxis genus. This was not random, it was deliberate, a funeral, a meal, a farewell, because even in death food spoke. It spoke of belonging, of memory, of care. In Upper Paleolithic Europe, ceremonial burials often included tools associated with food preparation, grinding stones, bone spatulas, carved ladles. These weren't just implements, they were symbols. To offer food to the dead was to acknowledge their continued presence, their continued hunger, their continued place among the living. And when the living gathered, they feasted. Feasting in prehistoric cultures was not mere indulgence, it was identity. It was power, it was sacred. At Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple complex, archaeologists uncovered massive stone vats, likely used to brew grain-based drinks. Thousands of animal bones, most from wild gazelle and aurochs, were found scattered around the site. These weren't just scattered meals, they were coordinated events, rituals, massive gatherings requiring planning, preparation, and purpose. But why feast at all? Because to share food is to forge connection. To divide meat is to declare peace. To pour drink is to honor God's ancestors or cosmic forces. In the absence of written language, early humans used the language of the feast, ritual meals, sacrificial offerings, seasonal banquets, to express gratitude, fear, longing, and faith. In Neolithic China, the Yangshao culture left behind painted pottery and signs of large communal meals. Fish bones and pig remains were often found buried beside human ancestors. In the Andes, the early inhabitants of the Norte Chico civilization organized feasts around seafood and cotton trade, long before the first cities rose from stone. These weren't acts of desperation, they were acts of abundance, of ceremony, of celebration. And it wasn't only about food's presence but also its absence. In many early cultures, fasting emerged as a form of purification. Before a hunt, before a storm, before a burial. To withhold food was to sharpen the senses, to elevate the spirit. To remind oneself that cooking was a privilege, not a guarantee. Because prehistoric life was never easy. Droughts came, herds vanished, crops failed. And in those moments of scarcity, cooking took on a new meaning. It became improvisation, innovation, faith in action. In the arid cliffs of the American Southwest, ancestral Puebloans developed pit ovens to cook agave and yucca roots, plants that were hard, bitter, and nearly inedible raw. These earth ovens would burn for hours, sometimes days, slowly transforming starches into sweet, edible fiber. This was not a quick meal. It was a slow ritual of survival, a belief that time and patience could turn hardship into sustenance. Across oceans, in Polynesian cultures, cooking was intimately tied to mana, the spiritual energy present in all things. Meals prepared in underground umu ovens were not just practical, they were ceremonial, offerings to gods, acts of respect to nature, ancestors, and the rhythms of the sea and sky. So when we ask what prehistoric humans actually cooked, we must also ask, for whom? Because sometimes it wasn't just for the family or the tribe. Sometimes it was for something higher. In the shadow of fire, food became myth. In many oral traditions, the first cook was divine, a spirit, a trickster, a god who taught humans to tame flame and knead dough. In Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, the rainbow serpent swallowed creatures and rebirthed them as sustenance. In early Indo-European myth, sacrificial fires carried the aroma of burnt flesh to the heavens, feeding gods with smoke while mortals fed on bone. These weren't just metaphors, they were blueprints, ways of understanding the world through what mattered most, nourishment. And across time, these rituals coalesced into culture. In prehistoric India, sacred hearths were arranged with astronomical precision. In Mesoamerica, the preparation of maize dough, nixtamalization, was done with care and reverence, transforming corn from simple starch into the divine body of gods like Quetzalcoatl and Sentiotl. In ancient Egypt, bread and beer were not just staples, they were sacred offerings to the dead. Cooking had become cosmic, and so we see that even in prehistory, food was never just food. It was a story, told through flame and flavor, through feast and famine. It was a way of binding people to land, to each other, to something greater than themselves. Every stew simmered with intention. Every roasted bone whispered a memory. Every grain ground on stone echoed a lesson learned through time. What did prehistoric humans actually cook? They cooked what they needed. They cooked what they loved. They cooked what they believed in. The ember never truly died. Long after stone tools gave way to metal, after cities rose and the written word spread across papyrus and parchment, the soul of prehistoric cooking remained, hidden in tradition, preserved in memory, echoing through the most primal parts of our kitchens: flame, bone, grain, and hands. Today we cook with machines. We eat food bred in laboratories, harvested by satellites, delivered by drones. But the question lingers: what did prehistoric humans actually cook, and what can we still learn from it? The answer, like the food itself, has layers. In recent years, archaeologists and anthropologists have begun to piece together the culinary habits of our ancient ancestors with astonishing detail. Residue analysis on pottery shards reveals traces of stews made from wild legumes and tubers. Charred remains of einkorn wheat, barley, and emmer point to early bread making, far older than the rise of Egypt or Mesopotamia. But it's not just what they cooked, it's how. At sites like the Natufian settlements in the Levant, dating back over 12,000 years, scientists found grinding stones stained with the pigments of wild grains and legumes. The people there weren't yet full-time farmers, but they were cooking with intention. They were soaking, fermenting, and flavoring their food. They were innovating. And innovation, it turns out, didn't end with history. Around the world today, indigenous communities still carry the flame of ancient cooking practices. In the Amazon, manioc is soaked, grated, and fermented to remove toxins, just as it has been for thousands of years. In the Pacific, emu earth ovens slow roast whole animals with hot stones and banana leaves. In parts of Africa, fermented sorghum porridge is still a staple, offering not just calories but gut-friendly probiotics that science only recently began to understand. These aren't quaint traditions, they're sophisticated adaptations, developed over millennia, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. They reveal a truth that modern science is only beginning to re-embrace. Prehistoric humans were not primitive. They were deeply attuned to nature, nutrition, and flavor. And now, slowly, we're listening. In elite culinary circles, the ancestral diet has gained attention. Not as a fad, but as a philosophy. Chefs look to ancient grains, teff, millet, amaranth, not just for novelty, but for their resilience, their nutritional density, their connection to climate and culture. Food scientists are studying fermentation and slow cooking methods with new reverence, recognizing their health benefits and environmental sustainability. Even the most basic act, cooking over fire, is making a comeback. Not a spectacle, but as a return to essence. Because fire does something the microwave never can. It creates memory. It cracks bone and caramelizes fat. It smokes, chars, burns, transforms. It reminds us that food isn't just fuel. It's change, it's story, it's time made edible. And yet, in all our rediscovery, there's something deeper at stake. To ask what prehistoric humans actually cooked is also to ask, who are we without our food? Because every stew stirred in a clay pot, every root dug from frozen earth, every piece of meat roasted over flickering flame, it all leads here, to us, to now, to a world so fast, so synthetic, so severed from its edible past, that many of us no longer know how to cook without instruction. But the knowledge is still there, in the soil, in the fire, in the rhythm of grinding stones, in the bitter roots and the sour berries, and the smell of smoke clinging to meat, and in us. Cooking is not just what we do, it's how we became human. We cooked not only to eat, but to gather. To mourn, to celebrate, to heal, to remember. In every culture, on every continent, food has always been more than sustenance. It has been language, religion, rebellion, love. So what did prehistoric humans actually cook? They cooked mammoth and mushroom, fish and fig, grain and grasshopper, stew and smoke, bread and bone. But above all, they cooked connection. And that connection endures. In every shared meal, in every passed-down recipe, in every kitchen that smells of something ancient and alive, we carry them with us, their hunger, their knowledge, their flame. And if we listen closely, if we stir slowly, if we taste with intention, we might just hear their voices in the crackle of the fire whispering, "This is who we were, this is who we are, this is how we lived."